Shalom. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want first to thank the Bar-Ilan Department of Sociology for welcoming us here, as well as the organizing committee of this conference, which was wise enough to invite me to talk to you. And I want to thank Billy for her excellent introduction. I want to say that I mentioned to Vice Rector that Billy is an expert in university branding, and that she also can help him understand the revulsion that people like him may have to branding, given that there's this sign just here on the pulpit. So the topic I want to talk to you today is a topic that has some emergency, to the extent that in American society today many people face a lot of anxiety about the future. I would even say that there's a feeling of hopelessness that many people are experiencing, given that there's a lot of confusion about what's ahead of us politically and otherwise. And these feelings have to do not only with the political campaign, but also very much with the growth of inequality. So I've been thinking a lot about what might be the way forward. And the talk that I'm going to present to you is very much building on two other presentations that I've given and papers that I've published over the last 2 years, which have to do with the process by which groups are claiming recognition. Recognition being a very central aspect of inequality that has not been studied with the same degree of systematicity as distribution of resources, the other face of inequality. And the two papers that are listed there, together with today's lecture, contribute to what I would describe as an empirical sociology of recognition and stigmatization processes, with the goal of understanding better how to broaden cultural membership to the largest number. And this is obviously a topic that has been also at the center of my work that I conducted with some of your colleagues. In 2016, I co-published with Anna Herzog, Nissim Mizrahi, and Joshua Gatzkow a book titled Getting Respect, Responding to Stigma and Discrimination in the US, Brazil, and Israel, where we compared over 400 respondents, African American, Black, Brazilians, and 3 groups in Israel, Mizrahim, Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Ethiopian Jews, in terms of the kinds of experiences of stigmatization that they experienced and how they responded, identifying very different patterns. So I will talk a little bit about this later in my presentation. But the focus of this talk is really this context that we're experiencing today of in our neoliberal advanced industrial societies, which I will argue are marked by a narrowing of the criteria through which we assess the worth and dignity of others. This is a context where being worthy increasingly means being economically successful, and with this narrowing of criteria of evaluation comes the rigidification of symbolic and social boundaries, which manifest themselves, for instance, through growing xenophobia, but also stronger boundaries toward the poor. And this has, of course, developed concomitantly with the growing popularity of populism and conservative and far-right parties. So my presentation is concerned not only with giving a diagnosis of the situation, but also to talk about solutions. And of course, the solutions are multidimensional. They certainly include an economic aspect, redistribution of resources. I do not deny this aspect, but this is not what I'm talking about today. I want to address specifically the place of the development of new narratives of hope. That is the cultural part of the equation, which has to do with extending cultural membership to the largest numbers. And the question is, how can we accomplish this? And I would argue that us, cultural sociologists and sociologists in general, but social scientists too, are perfectly well equipped to think together about this. And I will suggest a few possible approaches, but my goal is above all to invite you, and hopefully to invite a larger audience, the larger public, which to discuss how we might move in this direction. And I will explore 3 different strategies. One has to do with how to promote a plurality of criteria of worth in our society, how to reframe stigmatized groups, and how to publicize ordinary forms of universalism. But we also have a public sphere that is changing really fast with the diffusion of social media. So we need to understand what is the context under which producers and diffusers of scripts of work are operating today in the context of public domain that is now dominated by social media. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about is very much a work in progress in reaction to the situation in the US since 2016. I decided to write a book for a larger audience, which I've never done. So I signed a book contract with Simon & Schuster. So we'll see if I'm capable of doing this. But and the goal is really, as I said, to create a conversation. It's not one conversation, it's many conversations, and I'm going to throw ideas at you, and I hope that in the Q&A you'll be sufficiently engaged by what I'm presenting to you that you'll have other ideas that you will feel like sharing. So part 1 of the talk is the diagnosis, where I will discuss what I call the neoliberal scripts of worth and their negative effects across the class spectrum. It's not only the working poor that are suffering, people who are the victim of the opioid epidemic, but also the upper middle class, with a major mental health crisis in the American upper middle class, and the rigidification of group boundaries, which I'll talk about very briefly. But so I'll describe to you the situation, but the starting point of the talk is this concept of social resilience, which I discussed in a book that I co-edited with Peter Hall, a political scientist. A group of 15 scholars or so met 3 times a year since 2002 to develop a number of ideas, and this is it's a project that was called the Successful Societies Project, and this is a book that came out of this project. And the goal was really to think about the role of institutions and cultural repertoires in creating the conditions that give people resilience. So we define our project very much in contrast with the literature on grit, which celebrates, individual resilience, the exceptional individuals who are able to stand above their circumstances. In fact, we're interested in how societies create the tools that will allow people to, buffer themselves against the circumstances, the tools that they can depend upon. So one example would be same-sex marriage laws, which after they were passed in 32 states in the US, saw quite a drastic decline in the number of attempted suicide among LGBTQ youth in high school. So this is a case where this law sent to individuals clear messages about the fact that they belong to society, that they have access to its most sacred institution, marriage, and it gave them messages about cultural membership, which had a direct impact on their behavior. It's a kind of narrative and an institution simultaneously about possible futures and possible self that could inspire and resonate with these young people in a way that affected their lives significantly. So in the story I'm going to tell you, I approach hope as a very important part of the story. It's immaterial, but I view hope as a rope in the sense that it feeds inspirations, and it's especially when it is intersubjectively shared or intersubjectively supported. So if we think, for instance, of the work of medical sociologist Catherine Panther-Briggs, who has spent a lot of time studying kids in the refugee camps of Lebanon, she finds that the kids who prosper are the kids who are able to share with a significant other, an adult, a view of the future that, because it is shared, can seem real. So understanding how people sustain hope is crucial, but it really requires looking beyond the individual. It requires looking at shared understanding of the future. And representation of the future are made available to scripts. So we need to think about what are the scripts that are made available today, and how can they act as supplement of the American dream. So speaking of hope, often Americans think about the American dream as very central to this story. So the American dream has played an extraordinarily important role in American society, as most of you know. It has been an extraordinarily performing hope machine because it has proven very effective at appealing to the hearts and mind to orient action and define behavior. So it has provided many American citizens a normative sense of direction to their action. The answer to this question was, for most Americans throughout the 20th century, build prosperity. That's what we were supposed to do. It also provides standards by which to assess who is worthy and who belongs. The answer was the successful. A notion of who deserves to be trusted. The answer, those who try. In a definition of which groups are at the bottom of the pecking order, who are stigmatized, the answer was those who are lazy and lack self-reliance. So today, the literature of inequality may be characterized by the fact that many people who work in this literature are pretty obsessed with the idea that we should all be middle class. We should all be getting a college degree, we should all become professional and managers, or aspire to the kind of consumption or standard of living, the comfort level, accessible to the top 20% of the population, professionals and managers. But I think that this literature largely overlooks the fact that 100% of the population cannot be squeezed into the top 20%. It simply does not add up. So this is partly the case in the context of growing inequality, which we're experiencing today. So therefore, I'm arguing that the American dream is a very limited idea. I could even say it's a bankrupt idea, but I won't go so far because when I say that, it upsets people. But I think that we can at least say that it needs to be supplemented with other dreams and other narratives of hope that could be available to everyone. So the question is, what would these dreams be? So the general context of the presentation is the context of neoliberalism, which you're all familiar with, but I want to explain to you what I mean by that today. So it's an ideology, it's many things at once, it operates at the level of the market, at the level of the state, at the level of administration, and also at the level of the self. And this fourth dimension is the one that I'm most concerned with. We want to see its salience in today's society. Sorry, I'm gonna. We can look at the diffusion of the term through the news. So a LexisNexis search can show you that there was a surge in the salience of the term from 2015 to 2016, jumping from 686 reference to 1714, and that is true of American newspapers as well as European newspapers, which I found surprising because as I was starting the project, I thought it would be far more salient in Europe since it's a critical term, and the critical tradition is not as deeply developed in the United States. So here, the definition that I'm using is very much building on the paper by Peter Evans and Bill Sewell in our book, Social Resilience in the Neoliberal Era, in the sense that I'm regarding neoliberalism as a set of syncretic changes that are operating simultaneously at the economic, political, administrative, and cultural level to maximize market efficiency in the exchange of goods. And I'm here, the cultural part of the process manifests itself at the level of the scripts of the self that have been highly institutionalized under neoliberalism and which manifest themselves in the pursuit of material wealth, social status, and competitiveness, as well as in the privatization of risk or in self-reliance. To this, I would add meritocracy, to the extent that meritocracy is an ideology that justifies inequality by grounding it in individual merit. and it reinforces the salience of the other virtues affiliated with the American dream, that is a focus on material success, competitiveness, etc. So while it's quite difficult to trace the salience of the American dream, we can certainly trace the salience of meritocracy, and this is what one of our graduate students, Jonathan Michèle, has done in one of his papers. And it has shown that this term meritocracy has grown in popularity across most advanced industrial societies since 1930. So you cannot see very well here. I present you the data for only 4 countries. You can see that it has increased in salience in Germany, the UK, and the US quite significantly. And of all the 23 countries that were included in this study, it has increased in all but 5 countries. It has declined only slightly in Austria, Canada, and in France. So this is clear. Whether this is a story that's only about the US or about the far broader movement, I think this data certainly suggests that although there is anti-Americanism in all these countries, where the national identity is very much defined in opposition to the US, there's plenty of evidence that this movement toward an increasingly unidimensional definition of worth is taking place as a transnational phenomenon. So there is at the same time, I think, a crisis in the support for the, well, it's a double movement. On the one hand, faith in the American dream remains very high, which you can see in most surveys. And there's a number of conditions that make this possible. The fact that it's a very ambiguous term. Many people would say the American dream is having a good family. Well, who's not in favor of having a good family, right? Everyone likes that. And it's, of course, success. It's what has brought so many immigrants to American shores. It's the promise of a world of embeddlement and prosperity. But at the same time, in the context of growing inequality, of course, we know that the dream is not delivering for a very large number of people. And this is particularly clear as we look at what has happened across the various social classes. And that's what led me to believe that the American dream is also, to some extent, pernicious. So how can we say that the American dream is pernicious? I think it has affected whether group boundaries are becoming more rigid or permeable. So more specifically, what do we know? We know that the group that best demonstrates the virtues of neoliberalism, the virtues of competitiveness, socioeconomic success, and self-reliance, the upper middle class, or more specifically, college-educated professional and managers, are becoming hegemonic and are consistently depicted in the media as having the most desirable set of virtues and lifestyle. And concomitantly, the classes that are perceived as the least self-reliant, the poor and the working class, have become more stigmatized, with important ripple effect for the groups that have been associated with the poor and the working class, that is African Americans, illegal immigrants as well, who are perceived as using a disproportionate share of collective resources. And this bifurcation results in the growing recognition gap that feeds the multiplication of the recognition claims that we have witnessed over the last 10 years or so, ranging from Occupy to Black Lives Matter to Me Too to the movement in support of undocumented immigrants. But there are other reasons why, in my view, the American dream is pernicious. And that has to do, I've mentioned this, but I want to come back to it, the cultural hegemony of the upper middle class and its values and lifestyle. So many people have described the upper middle class as the unmitigated winners of the economic changes that we have experienced over the last decades. So think about the work of Rajchetty that has been very widely discussed. So despite its privileged position, this upper middle class has experienced growing challenges. And basically, we've heard a lot about the fear of falling, which has become more widespread within this group and which is having a wide-ranging ramification. So the upper middle class is increasingly worried about its ability to ensure the reproduction of its social position and about the possible downward mobility of their children. So the members of this class have been having fewer children and work very hard to pass on to them as many advantages as possible. They cannot resist engaging in an array of behavior aimed at guaranteeing their access to the best colleges and at passing on privileges, all forms of opportunity hoarding, sending their kids to more expensive private school, giving them access to private tutors and college counselors, etc. At the same time, these parents, as they are investing private resources in their kids, are believing more and more in meritocracy and are often blind to the ways in which they are passing on privileges, as are their own children who buy into meritocracy. But at the same time, this upper middle class is having more mental health challenges, particularly among non-Hispanic whites, the very group that is supposed to be doing so well. And when they are surveyed about their mental health, they cite various reasons why they are experiencing a lot of stress. And most of what they're pointing to is money and work. So there's a general decline in their quality of life that is associated with overwork and stress. So unsurprisingly, given this intensified investment, the upper middle class youth faces comparative pressure as well to be successful. So we have qualitative studies that have documented the negative impact of such pressures on teens in particular. So the lives of hyper-competition led by many leads them to feel overwhelmed and to engage in substance abuse. Indeed, this has been found to be higher among high-income kids than among inner-city kids, but there are contradictory findings on this. In particular, one study that is often cited is the UCLA National Survey of Freshmen that shows an increase in the number of students surveyed who say that they are feeling overwhelmed from between 1985 and 2015. And a lot of us who teach in American universities will tell you that the mental health service departments have a lot of problem meeting the demands. The number of students who want to have access to therapists is hitting the roof, and there's just, much greater awareness about the students to their need, but also universities feel that they really have to fill the demand and to attend to these things. That's true also of how we deal with graduate students. So despite these obvious flaws, the lifestyle, behavior, and the values of the upper middle class are repeatedly offered as a model for everyone to follow. So this is evidenced in the work of sociologist Richard Bush, who has done a content analysis of over 400 primetime American sitcoms over 60 years of television, and he has found that over 90% of all the characters in these sitcoms were upper middle class professionals and managers, but there were also some working class people. But in fact, the proportion of working class has been declining steadily, has been 10% of the characters, and have increased by only 1% in the last 10 years. And in the majority of cases, when you do have working class people who are present in the TV show, the working class men are presented as buffoons, who are incompetent, immature, ignorant, and irresponsible. So think of The Simpsons, for instance. So a parallel study has been conducted in Sweden that finds a very similar conclusion. So this exposure to rags and riches story in entertainment television serves to strengthen faith in the American dream. So, and this kind of entertainment has increased exponentially over the last decade. So a student of political communication, Inji Kim, who teaches at Duke, has shown that watching such programs has a significant effect on believing in the American dream, particularly among Republicans and those who are politically optimistic. So the impact of watching such shows has been as important as being children of immigrants. Children of immigrants being one of the categories that shows a very high commitment to the American dream. So this may suggest that much of entertainment television operates as a gigantic publicity machine for the distinctive scripts of self that are associated with the neoliberalism that the upper middle class incarnates. And the working class simply doesn't find its own reality reflected in entertainment television, because it feeds a very benevolent view of the rich, which has many implications for attitudes toward redistribution and social justice. So what's happening at the other end of the class spectrum? What about the working class? So in the early 1990s, I interviewed blue-collar workers and low-status white-collar workers in Paris and New York for my book, The Dignity of Working Man. And in that study, I found that American working men were far less critical of the professionals and managers, the Ken and Barbie people, as they call them, than it was the case for the French. So in both countries, workers often describe us, professionals and managers, as workaholic, obsessed with material success and socio-professional status, as somewhat superficial and self-centered, a bit narcissistic, and lacking in concern for others. They didn't have very high opinion of us. So, but I show in the book that Americans were far more under the spell of this upper middle class than their French counterpart, given the relative absence in the US of a cultural repertoire celebrating working class virtues such as solidarity, whereas in France you had repertoires such as socialism, Catholicism, republicanism, that brought in elements of egalitarianism that were less absent in France. So more concretely, American workers were more likely to truly measure their value by the standard of socio-economic success. So for instance, they would say, if I can buy a house and you can buy a house, we're equal. The notion that being able to buy a house determines that you're equal, as opposed to we're all equal as human beings. And consequently, they also were much more likely to think of themselves as losers, this category that is so salient in the American class landscape. In France, the French workers were not using this word losers. That was quite salient in the US. And the reason why this term was so salient is in part because they could not possibly score well by the criteria that they valued most. In contrast, the French workers who demonstrated more cultural distance and cynicism toward the upper middle class criteria, again, did not use this term. And I kind of did an update of this project with a colleague of mine, and we came to the conclusion that this is even more true today than it was when I did the interviews for The Dignity of Working Man in the early 80s, in that for many workers in the US, the American dream is increasingly becoming an impossible dream or a desperate dream. The dream has collapsed, and a large number are now left empty-handed. To measure one's self every day by the standard of middle-class consumption can only lead to self-destruction if it means accessing to this status is impossible. So studies show, therefore, that workers are looking toward the poor with a great deal of angst, as many experience what Barbara Ehrenreich has called the fear of falling, and believe that very little stands between them and homelessness. And this is where diversifying the criteria of worth from having to valuing various forms of being could be very empowering across classes, including, I think, for upper middle class youth. So it would not alleviate poverty or scarcity, but it could give a little breathing space to people. So the somber diagnosis suggests that there's a growing disconnect between the ideals of American society and what it actually delivers to its members, and the situation feeds hopelessness to the extent that there's mounting violence in the low-income neighborhood, a raging opioid epidemic, growing self-isolation of the working class, which has been documented by Andrew Cherling in his last book on the working class, which shows that increasingly workers are isolating themselves, fewer of them marry, fewer of them join the Knights of Columbus, fewer of them join religious organizations. So self-isolation is feeding the kind of anger that is manifesting itself today in politics. So we could discuss this in the Q&A if you're interested, as it's manifesting itself in the current context. So here I'm referring in this slide to a study I did with a colleague, Nicolas Guebou, who studied the French welfare recipients, where he shows in his work called L'autonomie des assistés that the French workers are now asked to demonstrate self-reliance, just as much as American workers have been asked to demonstrate self-reliance. So there's a convergence in also the stigmatization of the poor in both countries as being viewed as people who are not responsible, and a transformation of group boundaries with much stronger boundaries now toward the poor and blacks and youth. The youth were not salient when I did my interviews in '93, but now they're also very salient as people who are like takers, which for the working class is one of the worst categories possible. So this also translates in a hardening of group boundaries, which manifests itself at other levels. This in itself could be the topic of a lecture, so I'm just going to go very quickly here because I want us to have time to discuss. But I have, with my research assistant, we've looked at the American National Election Studies feeling thermometer that measures warmth toward various groups, and it shows a decline in solidarity toward various groups, particularly among Republicans, whether we look at a feeling of warmth toward blacks, toward Chicano and Hispanics. And you can see, I'm just giving you this, it's not fully developed, but you can see over the last few years a rigidification of group boundaries, the contrast being with LGBTQ, where this rigidification is not happening at the level of public opinion, even if it's happening in what Trump is saying about them. So I think if we put all of this together, it's easy to come to the conclusion that American society is facing a cultural crisis. And that was very clear to me as I was developing this project, that as I was talking with my colleagues, very few of them had a sense of hope. I would ask them, where do we take it from here? What's the way forward? And everyone was very pessimistic about the course on which American society is currently. And a lot of the diagnosis had to do with a cultural crisis, not only an economic crisis. So it's against this backdrop that I think we need to think about how to sustain a sense of hope and self-worth for a larger swath of the population. And this is the topic to which I turn now. So I think a lot of the challenge is to figure out how to produce new narratives of hope and how to create bridges. So a lot of social and political psychologists are currently concerned with studying how to create bridges between opposing factions and how to avoid feeding a zero-sum view of cultural conflicts. People are talking about tribalism, for instance. And there's been a hardening of opposition between conservatives and liberals, between Republicans and Democrats. And this research teaches us that picking one position or the other is counterproductive, as it pushes each group to defend their position against that of the other, which is, and I've been arguing that instead of thinking of this as an instinct tied to human nature, which I don't believe in, it's much better to try to think about the conditions that are feeding groupness. And that we need to think about other kinds of conditions that would feed a more pluralistic collective project that can accommodate a plurality of perspective as well as bridging cultural boundaries and group boundaries. So I think we may think about how to foster a multi-pronged approach to the production of new narratives of hope. And what I'm going to do is give you a few ideas about how we might want to do this. And that's, again, more like the beginning of a conversation than me really offering a solution. So the first element would be about fostering a plurality of criteria of worth. And here we may want to focus on the role of cultural intermediaries of all kinds, which includes social scientists. And I think we need to engage in a very explicit dialogue about how the current crisis is fed by our focus on neoliberal values and how to promote a diversity of criteria. So this would include highlighting how messages about cultural citizenship are conveyed through laws, rules, and taxation. So I'll give you an example from when I was growing up. I'm a Canadian, and I grew up during the peak of the nationalist movement in Quebec. And Pierre Trudeau, who was then the Prime Minister, was promoting the notion that Canada was a multicultural society. And he would tell French Canadians that while we thought we were one of the two founding nations, in fact our country was truly multicultural, and that the Ukrainians of southern Saskatchewan belonged to Canada as much as we did. And then he mobilized all the tools of the Canadian federal government to promote this notion, giving a lot of money to Ukrainian dances groups and various provinces, and using, Canadian public broadcasting to publicize the notion that Canada is a multicultural society. So it was truly an operation of engineering collective identity that took roots, to the extent that when you interview Canadians today about their national identity, in contrast to the US, they will say, well, we're multicultural and Americans are not multicultural. So it's an example of a trickle-down effect that has been extremely powerful in reframing collective identity. So what I'm telling you here is not surprising to any of us who have studied the process by which collective identities is engineered, but certainly an example of how broadening cultural repertoires of the criteria of belonging has had a very powerful effect. So if we want to transpose this to the current context, we can think about what's happening with the younger people, the Gen Zs and the millennials, who we know are going through a particular tough time in that they're not able to buy houses. They tend to stay in their parents' basement. They have a lot of problem moving on in life and making babies and becoming fully adults. When they are being surveyed about their attitudes, they are cherishing several values that are really crucial to them, and these have to do with inclusion and social justice, as well as sustainability and anti-consumerism, as well as authenticity. And authenticity is often defined in opposition with materialism. So the project that I'm in the process of developing is very much grounded in analyzing what are the values that this group is adopting, and particularly who are the people who are promoting and making available the scripts that these groups are embracing. So I'm in the process of doing interviews with what I call agents of change, or cultural intermediaries who are centrally involved in making these scripts available. So a few examples, I've interviewed a woman named Jess Wiener, who was hired by Mattel to create new Barbies that come, I think, in 7 different phenotypes, and there's now even a transgendered Barbie. And she's also the woman who's behind the Dove campaign, the soap campaign, where women in underwear, women of all sizes, were there to advertise. So this is an example of someone whose mission in life, and it was very clear when I interviewed her, was to put out there, if you think in Durkheimian terms, collective representation, put seeds of diversity all over our representation of what the world looks like. And this is happening simultaneously at a great many levels. Another example is a woman who works for Feeding America, which is the largest NGO that is fighting hunger in the United States, an African-American woman who, and this is a charitable organization that operates through over 200 soup kitchens around the country. And we had an interview where she spent a lot of time telling me how within her organization she's fighting to promote narratives about social justice and racial justice, which creates a lot of conflict because the organization needs to fundraise with a great many people to be able to continue to bring in money. And the CFO is having a heart attack each time she pronounces the word racial justice. Because a lot of the millennials who are working for this organization don't want it to just be a charitable organization. They say there's no point to trying to fight hunger in the US if you cannot name the problem, which is racial justice. So whether we look at the level of corporations, where there's, you know, employers who are giving family leaves, who recognize by doing that, that parents are there not only as workers, as producers, but they're also there as caregivers, as parents and as friends and as mothers. So celebrating, or at least acknowledging, the plurality of ourselves in institutionalizing such programs, which was the result of a very important fight in the US. There's a book by Alberson that describes this. So the project is very much anchored in doing interviews with a lot of people who are doing this work of promoting the values that the Gen Zs and the millennials are doing, and that's also happening through entertainment television. So one of the people I interviewed is a trans person who was the main advisor on the show Transparent. Those of you who've never watched Transparent, I urge you to watch it. It's an older man, well, I guess trans person, sorry for the use, who, after having raised his children, decides that he really is a woman. And there's this amazing episode where he goes to spend a weekend with other men who likes to, or other people who like to dress as women, and you can really connect through this specific episode about how relieved and happy this person is to be able to be himself for a weekend. And the person I interviewed was an advisor on the show in terms of helping the people in Hollywood figure out how to represent the reality of trans people in a way that is true to them. And as I'm doing these interviews, you can see, I mean, it's an enormous amount of cultural work that is being put out there to represent these people in a way that is authentic. And so that is part of the project, to really try to understand how these new values, or they're not new values because a lot of them are old, but how they are becoming mainstream. And that's a cultural process, the process of cultural diffusion and production that can be studied empirically. So that's where the tools of cultural sociology become helpful. And I think these new scenarios, these new scripts of self are truly feeding this millennial group that experiences a great deal of skepticism, in part because of their experience in the labor market, but also because they are rejecting the dream of their parents. They don't want the same life that their parents wanted. And that is, I think, something that sociologists are far from having fully grappled, especially when it comes to the implication for what is ahead of us. And this is true of the millennial generation. And on this slide, I've listed some of the findings about this group, the fact that they have, enormous access to the social media and are therefore extremely well informed, but also much more privatized in their form of social involvement. But the Gen Zs, for their part, are far more political. I don't know how many of you, well, we all teach, right? So we all have contacts with the Gen Zs. It's really quite startling to have them talk about the crisis with sustainability and the decision to not have children, which are quite often politically motivated. Well, we'll see if they change their mind as they get older, but for the moment, it's in, the salience of inclusion and the way that they talk about sexuality in a non-binary way, I think all suggest their desire to be in touch with the essence of the person. One of the key sentences, I think, that captures the values of this generation is this experience, I see you, which is totally about recognition. I get you, I understand who you are as a person. And that's a term that constantly comes back when we talk about sexuality, about race and ethnicity. So the question of where these commitments come from, I think, is absolutely crucial and something that we need to understand better as sociologists. And a lot of my project is about that. So a second approach is really to understand better how boundaries can be transformed and made more fluid. So here, the stance I take is very much in contrast with the implicit association test that has been promoted by psychologists. The idea is that instead of changing how people perceive at the individual level, we need to transform the scripts through which groups are framed. So here I'm referring to a paper that I co-authored with graduate students about the destigmatization of people living with HIV/AIDS, African American, and the obese, with the obese being the group that remains deeply stigmatized in American society, which we can compare with people who live with HIV/AIDS, which has been an extremely successful case. And we have looked closely at secondary analysis, detailed case analysis of how the destigmatization process has worked for these various groups. And I've argued that the successful case results from looking at how social actors who are primarily knowledge workers and social movement have collaborated in drawing on existing ideologies to transform representation. So it's to say that representations of groups are cultural structures that can be changed. So by having all of us take these implicit association tests, where we realize that we have, anti-black stereotypes because we pushed a button, a little slower when it comes to white people or black people is not the solution. So it's an argument for transforming cultural structures instead of making us more self-aware that we are, that we have stereotypes or are racist. So a third approach really has to do with this book that I mentioned earlier, for which we interviewed over 400 people about experiences of stigmatization that our respondents had experienced, and through very close inductive analysis, we were able to document patterns that were quite different across countries, with basically African Americans being extremely experiencing all kinds of forms of assault on the self. Instead of experiencing blatant racism, they more often referred to how they were overlooked, underestimated. Black Brazilians, in contrast, were much more likely to explain what was happening to them by the fact that they were perceived as poor than because they thought they were black. For them, the explanation was, people think I'm poor, not people are racist toward me because I'm black, which is a strong contrast with the situation in the US. Whereas Palestinians, Arab Palestinians were experiencing blatant racism, but also always felt like they were perceived as the enemy within. So the actual experience of stigmatization was described with very different words in the three contrasts. And we also had very different patterns of response, with a lot of direct confrontation in the US, whereas among Arab Palestinian you had more absence of response, in part because of a feeling of powerlessness. And a lot of hesitation also in the Brazilian context, in part because of hesitation about is this because of race or because of class, lots of confusion about what was happening. And we developed an explanation for our findings that had to do with this concept of groupness, which is to say that the two groups that were most strongly bounded, where the group had very high degree of awareness of who they were as a group and who was not part of the group, Arab, Palestinian, and African American had very different responses, with a lot of confrontation in the case of African American, but far less confrontation in the case of Arab Palestinian, despite their strong boundaries. So we proposed that, in fact, to account for these differences, one needed to take into consideration the cultural repertoires that were available to people, for instance, the notion of American dream, racial democracy, or Zionism, which prompted very different responses than it was the case in the across context. So the takeaway from this is that to understand how people respond, it's very useful to look in detail at how ordinary people are dealing with racism. Here I'm giving you too much material. I should not have gotten into this, but I wanted to mention this because some of my co-authors said not that many, maybe not, it's possible that some people among Israeli sociologists are not that aware that this book exists. So it's a chance for you to say the book exists. But in fact, to go back to the overall argument, another strategy for fostering a wider definition of words is to pay attention to how ordinary people are engaging in everyday, what I call ordinary universalism, which is also something that Michèle Lamont is now studying, which has to do with, you know, and I think the difference here between the college-educated and people who are not college-educated is very different. So when I wrote The Dignity of Working Man, I did a lot of interviews with North African immigrants living in France, and I asked in this context, what makes people equal? What makes, because, you know, a lot of the interviews ended up being about what are the similarities and the differences between the French and North African immigrants in France and blacks and whites in the US. A lot of the interviews revolved around moral and racial boundaries, so it came up a lot. So one of the questions of the interview schedule was, you know, in what ways are people of different, you know, backgrounds similar and different? So I analyzed inductively their responses. And there were responses, I was very struck by how much their responses were grounded in everyday experience. They had not read Rousseau or Locke or, you know, any of the classical liberal theory. And so they drew on their everyday experience, and they would say things such as, well, we're all equal because we all spend 9 months in our mother's womb, or we all have 10 fingers, or we're all children of God, which is for someone who's agnostic, a quite surprising statement, but for people who are really religious, it's something that may be deeply held as a notion. Or there's good and bad people in all races, which is something that you hear absolutely everywhere. So these kinds of statements don't require having a college degree, and I think that one of the big problems with us academics is that we forget the extent to which non-college educated people don't know the difference between socialist doctrine and liberal doctrine. So a recent book I read on Fox News, Fox Populism, reminds us that most Americans really hate the news. They don't want to learn about the news. The only thing they want to hear about is entertainment. So because Fox News offers them entertainment as information, it's extremely popular. And Fox News has succeeded in convincing Americans that Trump represents their political interest. And it has done that in part by showing them how Trump's class habitus resonates with their own. So jokes where he makes fun of, you know, handicapped people, everything having to do with non-political correctness, the sexism, the grab the pussy jokes, and that this, by really downplaying any difference in ideology and emphasizing similarities in habitus, where Trump and the working class viewers overlap, is how Trump News has seen its own popularity increase together with the popularity of Trump. And there's a new book by Jennifer Silva, which is based on interviews with people who live in the mining countries of Pennsylvania, which shows when she interviewed them about their preferences for the election, who will you want to vote for? They would say, well, Trump or Sanders, not realizing in any way that their ideology are incompatible. So I think one of the things we need to do as social scientists to understand how to move forward is really to step back and try to understand in a much more deeper way what are the taken for granted, the background assumptions on which many non-college educated people think about equality, because I think we're just missing the picture entirely. And for the last 4 years, so many American social scientists have gone around saying, well, why is it that people are supporting Trump without being able to make sense of it? In part, I think, because we're so caught up in our own, you know, liberal, progressive worldviews that we cannot understand, for instance, the ways in which Hillary Clinton's statements about deplorables was probably the best-selling point Trump ever had in incarnating the pretentiousness and the strong class boundaries that many professionals deeply feel toward the working class, the superiority of our knowledge. So all this is to say that moving toward a more pluralistic understanding of work will require for progressive professionals and managers, if we're serious, to become far more skeptical toward our own worldview concerning who is worthy of our time and who is worthy as a human being, and reconnecting with very basic notions of humanity that I think have really gone totally, have been lost to many academics who are social scientists. I think we really live in our own, little world there, and we have to reconsider what we're doing when it comes to making sense of those voters. So finally, a fourth-pronged approach to thinking differently about how to foster a more multiple pluralistic conception of the self would be to think about what produces cultural change and what makes people resonate to cultural change. So I think we need to, and this is more of an agenda for social science researchers, to create multidisciplinary teams for studying how the production of hope works. And I think this requires not only the mobilization of cultural sociologists, but also the mobilization of psychologists of emotion. We really need multidisciplinary collaboration because rituals are sustained by emotions. We need to be able to look at emotion, moral boundaries, institution in connection with each other. And the current division of labor that we have in the social sciences, I think, does not allow us to ask these questions the way we should. So in terms of where I am now with this project, since I told you from the beginning that it's a work in progress, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how to study the public sphere. So this is something that Bob Darnton produced when he was studying the public sphere in 18th century France. So you have people like salon, café, public gardens, things that are probably irrelevant for now. So one of the challenges, I think, is a lot of the literature on the public sphere is not that empirical. And you have a lot of people who are studying social media without really connecting that much with the current conditions under which collective representations are produced and how they are produced differently in different countries. So in Norway, for instance, the elite, the economic elite, the cultural elite, the media elite, it's a very small country where these elites are very interdependent of each other. But Mike Savage has a new book that shows that in most advanced industrial society now, if you think of the Bourdieusian schema of the cultural pole of the dominant class and the economic pole of the dominant class being in competition with each other, well, that's over. The cultural pole has totally lost. So, the economic pole has become fully dominant. So how are we going to reconceptualize the production of collective representation in a context of subordination? And yet, you think in France, the state is still supporting public television in a very serious way. It's true in Canada too. So I think what we need to do is move toward a comparative sociology of elites and of the production of cultural representation in the public sphere to understand better how to approach the question empirically. And that's what I'm, moving toward as I'm working on this book, and I'm conceptualizing this book as a case study with interviews with various subgroups, which includes re-interviewing African Americans who were interviewed for Getting Respect to understand 10 years later how they understand the American dream now in 2019. We're also interviewing a number of Gen Zs in the Midwest and on the East Coast to understand their relation with the American dream, but also what gets them going in the morning, what are their repertoires of hope. And we're doing both a sample of upper middle class youth, but also more people who go to lower standing universities who have families that are more working class. And then a series of interviews with the agents of change from various segments of society as well as social media influencers. So it's going to be a very programmatic book and one that is meant to try to get people to think about these issues. Not sure at all that I will come up with the deep answers, but my goal is certainly to try to create a conversation around these questions. And I'm very curious about whether you feel like some of the questions I'm talking about resonate with the Israeli context. It's a book that's going to be written for an American audience, but I also hope that it can also, create conversation about the extent to which these trends are also found beyond the US and how can we address them. I know that Israeli society has its own challenges, but you know, nevertheless. And finally, since this is a group of sociologists, I want to conclude by saying that there is a causal argument. It's not just you know, just so story here, and it draws on various papers that I produced over the last few years that all have to do with the micro-meso-macro link and how everyday changes, you know, everyday action, whether or not we decide as professionals and managers to put our kids in public school or private school really feeds into, you know, the degree, in the American context, let's say the spatial segregation, the racial composition of our schools. And I hope that it's a book that will also inform people's choice as they go in their everyday life about thinking about what society we want to live in. So I will stop here. Thank you.